Jonathan Carter stood at the edge of the lake, the reflection of the moon shimmering over the calm waters, as if mocking the chaos brewing inside his soul. At 56, he had everything most people would envy: a sizable house in Colorado, a successful marketing agency, and a bank account that didn't know what struggle meant. Yet inside he felt hollow. The stillness around him felt suffocating rather than peaceful. He lit a cigarette he promised his doctor he'd quit years ago, and with a bitter smirk, muttered to himself, "I did it all wrong, didn't I?" Jonathan hadn't always been like this. There was a time when he was full of promise, a kid from Ohio with big dreams and relentless energy. As a young man, he believed the world owed him something. He thought success was about power, money, and showing people you made it. And that mindset drove most of his decisions. He hustled harder than anyone else, ignored relationships that didn't serve his goals, and treated kindness like a weakness. And now, standing in the silence of a life that looked perfect on paper, he finally saw the truth. He had ignored the very lessons that could have given him true happiness. The first lesson he had ignored was the value of relationships. His best friend growing up, Mike Henderson, had been his brother in everything but blood. They shared dreams, laughter, and the bond of kids trying to escape the limitations of small-town life. But once Jonathan started seeing success, he looked down on Mike's simpler choices: becoming a high school teacher, marrying his college sweetheart, having a modest home. Mike had once called to invite Jonathan to his wedding. Jonathan didn't show up, claiming work had come up last minute. In truth, he just didn't see it as important. Now, decades later, Mike was happily married, surrounded by people who loved him. Jonathan hadn't spoken to him in 20 years. Then there was his marriage. Samantha Carter was the kind of woman who saw through facades. She loved Jonathan when he had nothing and stood by him through the roller coaster years of building his business. But over time, Jonathan began treating her like a background character in his movie. He'd come home late, rarely asked how her day went, and showed little interest in their kids' lives. Samantha stayed quiet for years, trying to hold the family together. But one evening, she simply packed her bags, left a letter on the kitchen table, and walked away. "I miss who you were," she had written. "But I can't keep chasing the ghost of a man who left the room long ago." Jonathan hadn't fought for her. He had let her go, thinking she'd come back when she saw how much she needed him. But she never did. And their children. They grew up visiting him on scheduled holidays, like checking off an obligation. They didn't hate him, they just didn't know him. The second lesson he had ignored was health. Jonathan believed success required sacrifice, and sleep, nutrition, and mental peace were the first to go. He'd skip meals, pull all-nighters, and laugh off the stomach ulcers and panic attacks. He saw doctors as an inconvenience, gym memberships as a waste of time. By 45, he was on 5 different medications, and by 50, he had suffered a minor heart attack. It wasn't until he was sitting in a cold hospital room with wires strapped to his chest that he realized how fragile life was. But by then, the damage had been done. The third lesson was emotional intelligence. Jonathan was brilliant at strategy, but emotionally, he was tone-deaf. He mistook being intimidating for being respected, and being feared for being admired. He couldn't understand why employees didn't stay long or why meetings felt like battlefields. He once had a young intern, Chloe, who came to him with a fresh idea for the company's branding. Instead of listening, he cut her off and said, "That's not how we do things here." She left the company a month later. A few years later, Chloe's new agency won a national award, ironically for the exact campaign she once pitched to him. Jonathan began realizing his emotional ignorance when he sat alone at his own retirement party. The venue was fancy, the drinks flowed, but the crowd was thin. Most people had sent recorded messages or polite excuses. The few who came offered generic congratulations, but none stayed long. It hit him then. He had built a fortress, not a family. An empire, not a community. Then came the lesson of giving back. When Jonathan was younger, he always said he'd donate to charity once he made it. But somehow, he never got around to it. There was always a bigger deal, a new car or another investment. He once watched a documentary on homeless veterans and was moved to tears, but did nothing. He convinced himself that one day, he'd create a foundation or write a big check. Now, with time slipping through his fingers like sand, he realized he'd given the world nothing beyond quarterly reports and ad campaigns. One winter afternoon, feeling the weight of regret settle deeper than the cold in his bones, Jonathan received a letter in the mail. It was from his granddaughter, Ella, whom he barely knew. She was 10. Her handwritten note read, "Hi Grandpa, Mommy said you live in a big house. Do you ever get lonely? I want to visit you sometime and show you my painting. Love, Ella." He stared at the letter for an hour. That simple, innocent question cracked open something inside him. Do you ever get lonely? It echoed in his mind like a haunting melody. That night, Jonathan made a decision. He couldn't undo the past, but maybe he could learn from it. Maybe, just maybe, there was still time to apply the lessons he had so foolishly ignored. He began with a phone call to Mike. After 5 failed attempts, Mike finally picked up. "Jonathan?" he asked, voice laced with confusion. "Yeah," Jonathan said. "I don't even know how to begin this call. But I'm sorry. For everything." There was a long pause. Then, to Jonathan's surprise, Mike replied, "You're about 20 years late, but I'm glad you finally called." They spoke for hours that night, about life, about regrets, about everything in between. Next, he reached out to his kids. Instead of emails or gifts, he asked if he could come visit. Not in a business suit. Not as a boss. Just as a dad. First, there was hesitation. But slowly, cracks of hope began to appear. Jonathan also started volunteering at a local youth center. At first, he didn't think he had anything to offer. But the kids didn't care about his past mistakes. They just saw a man who listened, who showed up, who cared. One young boy named Marcus, struggling with anger and abandonment issues, took a special liking to him. Jonathan saw himself in Marcus, fighting the world without realizing the war was within. He also adopted a dog from a rescue shelter. He named her Grace. Every morning, Grace waited by the door, tail wagging, reminding him that loyalty didn't have to be earned with power, just presence. With time, Jonathan started documenting his journey. He wrote a memoir titled, "What I Wish I Knew Before It Was Almost Too Late." The book became a quiet hit, not because it was brilliantly written, but because it was brutally honest. People connected with the vulnerability, the raw truth of a man who had it all and realized he'd traded diamonds for dust. One afternoon, he was invited to speak at a local high school. He stood before students barely 18, brimming with dreams like he once was. He said, "You might think the world is about winning, but I'm here to tell you it's about connecting. Listen more."